You know, a dream is like a river, ever changing as it flows. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Maxwell Ivy again, also known as The Blind Blogger, and you can find me at theblindblogger.net. And this is another episode of What's Your Excuse? Today, I'm very blessed to have with me a fellow author who also happens to be blind, and we're going to learn a bit about his story and discuss some of the issues that come up for writers, for bloggers, and for visually impaired. We'll just see where it all goes. His name is Peter Altschul, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly because, trust me, I've had trouble with his name all week long. You can find him at peteraltschul.com, which is ALTSCHUL, and he's written 2 books so far. His first one is called Breaking Through, Working and Living While Blind, and his most recent one is called Breaking It Down and Connecting the Dots, which is a collection of his most popular and favorite blog posts. And this guy blogs on just about every subject under the sun, including politics, which is something y'all know I stay away from. Lives with his guide dog in Missouri, and I guess I'll just let him tell you more about himself so I don't ruin it all. Peter, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, just fine, just fine. It's a little cold here, but I feel funny complaining about the cold to somebody from Missouri.
Yeah, I think it's like 10 degrees here and no sun. It's a Christmas, post-Christmas blah kind of day, but fortunately there's lots of football to watch.
You mean there's football on?
Yeah, there's football on.
Okay, all right. I've been kind of soured on football after seeing the Patriots win. I don't know, what is it, like 9 Super Bowls in the last 11 years or something. So
no, I'm with you with the Patriots, but I still watch football. So
all right. Well, why don't you tell people a little bit more about your background, because you've been a lot of places, done a lot of things. I mean, you're a perfect example of the modern day person who basically didn't end up doing the job he started out doing.
Thank you. Before I do that, I want to correct the title of my first book, which is called Breaking Barriers, Working and Loving While Blind. And as you said, my second book is Breaking It Down and Connecting the Dots. And the subtitle of that book is Creating Common Ground Where Contention Rules. And creating common ground has been a major part of most of my professional life. I started working as a customer service rep for the most hated federal government agency, which I won't identify for purpose of this interview.
Oh, you can identify them. I used to work for them too. I was in a call center in Oklahoma City for 2.5 years.
You worked for the most hated government agency in the United States?
Yes, I worked for the Internal Revenue Service. I was in collections and handled 4 suicide attempts during a 2.5-year period.
Well, I never had handled those, but one of my colleagues did, and it was pretty frightening. Anyway, then I worked for the Bank of New York doing more customer service work, and then I went back to school and got my master's in social work with a specialization in organization behavior. So I really am sort of a composite master of social work and master of organizational psychology. Then I ran 2 grants, and this is where the common ground began to come in. My first major federal grant was working with universities, employers, and students with disabilities to improve the opportunities for college students with disabilities. And then I worked in a project linking schools throughout New York State, vendors, and school administrators on improving the way technology was made available to students. After I finished that work, while I was doing that, I trained New York City taxi drivers in customer service skills, which was a whole nother experience. And then I got this project, moved from New York City to Washington, D.C., to promote dialogue and common action between pro-life and pro-choice activists. And when I mean activists, I don't mean your run-of-the-mill average person. I mean people who ran clinics where abortions were performed, and those who protest outside of clinics, and those who were in charge of Planned Parenthood, and those who were in charge of the pro-life movement. So there was a really interesting amount of work that we did. And then once I got through that project, I worked with Reuters, which is a large media conglomerate, I ran one of their unit's diversity programs and ultimately did some consulting work for them. After that, I did some work in the area of immigration reform, worked for a nonprofit who was involved with that process. And then I moved out to Columbia, Missouri to get married, and all of a sudden became a father of 3 stepkids. In addition to my guide dog, this is my 6th guide dog, I had working with 3 or as many as 3 standard poodles, 3 stepkids, a new wife, and a python named Monty. So since I've been out here, I have done some consulting work. I actually now tutor University of Missouri student athletes, mostly on writing, but a few other things as well. And I do some consulting work, and obviously I've written 2 books, and I blog a lot. And I didn't mention my background as a musician, and I've sort of reconnected with my music background, and now sing in a variety of choirs, do some composition, and play drums for the church praise band. So I'm a fairly busy guy.
Yeah, well, see, that's the perfect example of me getting it wrong, only to give somebody else an example of an excuse to get it right, and to tell everybody just where you come from, because it is a long way to get to where you're doing now. And I remember reading that you are a musician, and I listened to some of your Christmas music on the website, and I told you, I think I mentioned that it was a shame we didn't get more time before this interview, because I would have liked for us to have sang something at the end of the show. But hey, that maybe when you come back next year for your next book, or
maybe next year we could just do a thing of my Christmas music. That in itself is an interesting story, I think.
Well, cool.
We can talk about that.
All right, so yeah, we'll talk about that. Let's see. All right, but you've done a lot as far as trying to get people to come together, as you mentioned. What about the training the New York City cab or taxi drivers? I'd like to hear a little bit about that. Does that sound like something that probably wasn't an easy sell on your part?
It was a very difficult sell, and part of the reason was the mayor at the time was Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who was a very unpopular mayor among people who weren't white people. If you were African American, if you were Latino, if you were from other countries, you probably wouldn't like the mayor. And most cab drivers fit to that second category. And the mayor required that all cab drivers take part in a customer service program because he was getting too many complaints from passengers, most of which were justified. Some cab drivers aren't the most nice people in the universe. So I was part of a group of people who trained New York City taxi drivers, and every 2 or 3 days a week or 3 or 4 days a week for 4 hours, I would have a bunch of cab drivers come in and mumble a lot, and I try to take them through a 4-hour program that would hopefully be of some relevance to them. And it was fascinating. It was one of the most interesting work I've ever done, because I was dealing with people from all over the world, most of whom had some experience driving cabs and had their own stories to share, and most of whom spoke pretty good English. There was I think, a wrong stereotype that most cab drivers did not speak English, but most cab drivers that I worked with spoke pretty good English, sometimes with accent, but spoke perfectly understandable English. They had other problems, but it was a really interesting group of people to work with.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things is that English has become the language of currency that people around the world, if they want to do business, have determined they need to do it in English. So I agree with you. You might run into some thick accents, but in general, the ability to speak and understand the language is pretty common in people from most other countries.
I agree, and would add that I wish that we did a better job in our schools teaching foreign languages. Most people in other countries start learning English when they're 6 or 7 years old. We don't start usually, if we're lucky, until middle school. That's way too late. I wish more schools would start, teaching, encouraging kids to learn at least one other language besides English.
Yeah, in many other countries, Russia, China, for example, not only are they required to learn English, but in many cases they're required to know 3 or more languages.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. But I'll start with one other language besides English. I'll start with that one.
I have interesting email conversations with people from the UK just trying to figure out some of the words they're using. And my Spanish was barely good enough in Texas to operate a kid's duck pond without getting myself beat up. But I don't think I can figure out words and phrases, but I've never managed to actually speak a language. Just like I can play chords, but I've never learned to be able to play music, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes perfectly good sense.
And that's the way my Spanish is. I may understand the words and the rules, but when it comes to having a conversation and using the words as if I'm speaking the language, and it'd be like finger spelling and saying that I know sign language. It would be about that level of communication ability. So one of the few things I really regret is that I've never been able to learn to play an instrument, which is probably why it's a good thing I sing. So that was cool. You worked with the taxi drivers to try to make them more customer friendly. Did you specialize on how they dealt with the visually impaired, or just people in general?
It was primarily people in general, but one of the components was disability awareness, because that was one of the complaints. And I didn't spend a lot of time talking about disability. It wasn't part of the curriculum. Occasionally I'd get into conversations with them about, since I have a guide dog and the guide dog was there. In fact, there was a very funny time, which I think is in the book, one of the books, where my guide dog was lying, tied up to the table, was doing just fine. And then a cab driver walked in with food. And I didn't know this, but you weren't supposed to have food in the training room. It was one of the rules of the road. And I was talking about whatever I was talking about. And one of the drivers said, "Hey, can you get your dog away from here?" And I said, "Gee, I'm so sorry. What is he doing?" And he said, "He's glaring at my sandwich."
Was that Dunbar?
Yes, that was Dunbar.
That was Dunbar. Yeah. I tell you, that's one of the things I love about your first book. I haven't read your second one yet. Is that every single one of your dogs has their own personality, and that's something only dog lovers and pet lovers will get, because people who don't understand having pets will be like, "How can you give human characteristics to a dog?" But each one of these dogs was totally different, not only in their personality, but in the way you worked with them.
Yeah, no, it really is different. All my dogs tend to be more toward the ornery side of the spectrum. That doesn't mean they're nasty dogs. They just have their own personalities and are strong-willed, because that's the way I am. And so that's been, a challenge, but all my dogs have been terrific. But as you said, all different. So Dunbar was the one who called out this cab driver. And so somebody said, "Hey, dude, you're not supposed to eat in here." And everybody laughed. And I got Dunbar back under control. We went on with the training.
Yeah, and I also think it's cool that you. It's obvious that they're part of your story, but I think it's great that you spend as much time as you do, not only letting us meet you, but also introducing us to the different dogs that you've had at the different points in your life. It really ties the story together very well. And if you wanted to, you could run down the list of the dogs just shortly to maybe name, breed, and about
Sure.
what time of your life you owned them in.
Sure. Oh, my first dog was a Weimaraner. Now, they don't use Weimaraners too much anymore for guide dogs, but my first guide dog was a Weimaraner named Heidi. And she primarily was with me when I was in New York City trying to break into the music business as a jingle writer and pop song writer and producer. And so we spent a lot of time wandering around Manhattan, going to various publishing companies and jingle houses and trying to get her name known. And then toward the end of my time with her, I got my first job, and that was with the IRS. And then my second dog was a chocolate lab named Nan, and she was the one who worked with me as I finished my customer service phase of my life and got my master's degree at Columbia University School of Social Work. That was my sort of joint degree in social work and organizational psychology. And then started my work as a grants manager. And then Dunbar came along and continued my work as a grant manager and training taxi drivers. And he was also involved with my work on abortion. So we did a lot of travel to Arizona because I was doing a lot of my work down there. So he spent way too much time in Arizona. And then my next dog was Gifford, and Dunbar moved down to Washington, D.C. with me so that he had to deal with a new environment. Gifford came along, and he worked with me as I worked with Reuters, the media agency or organization, and also doing consulting work. I did some work for the World Bank when he was there, and I also did some work for other organizations. And then then I got Jules, a black lab, and he was the main subject of the first book. I mean, the first book, Breaking Barriers, primarily starts with the training at Guiding Eyes and talks about how the training works for me and so on and so forth. But it flashes back to various parts of my life. So it is a guide dog book, but it's, I think, far more than that. And so that was Jules, and Jules moved out to Columbia with me and was part of my wedding and became a suburban dog. He was an urban dog, but became a suburban dog. And then in 2012, he retired, and now I have my current guide dog, Heath, who has been a suburban dog and, does my work. He goes to church with me and walks around the neighborhood and does what guide dogs do, and also has been to conferences with me. And I'm forgetting something. Anyway, so that's Heath.
Well, cool. I just wanted to get them all in there. People have heard me talk about my my most recent dog, Penny, who's not around anymore. Like I said, for people who have dogs, cats, horses that are part of their families, they become part of the story whether you want them to or not. And in your case, it would have been more of a omission if you had left them out. But I think really they're part of who we are at that particular moment in time.
And what I should say to folks who have vision is that there are pictures of all these dogs in my first book, Breaking Barriers. And there's several pictures of my most recent dog, Heath, in my most recent book, if you get the either the ebook version or the print version.
Right. Well, we're going to talk about the second book in just a little bit here. I want to remind people I am speaking with Peter Altschul. You can find him at peteraltschul.com, ALTSCHUL. And I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the guide dog. One is, do you think that they make it overall make it easier or harder for you? Did you notice any advantage, say, when you were dealing with those highly charged situations between the pro and anti-abortion groups?
That's a really interesting question. The answer is, I think for the most part, people find dogs relaxing. There are people who don't like dogs very much, but most people, most of the time, find dogs kind of cool to be in the room. And if they see a dog who's relaxed and sleeping and well under control and not nervous, even if they do weird things once in a while, I think it relaxes. I think it relaxes them. In fact, many people would come to me and say, "It's so nice to have a dog in the room. It relaxes me. If he can sleep through it, then I can survive." Because I was working with people on some fairly controversial topics. Not just abortion, but race relations and cab drivers and customer service and getting employers and university folks to talk together when they usually didn't do that very well, and getting university people and technology people to talk together, they didn't do that very well either. So getting people to have those conversations, I think the dog, in a very small but significant and subtle way, made it a little easier for everybody.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. Just before I quit working for the Internal Revenue Service, one of the other employees in our team said, "Max, we were all disappointed when you came to work here." And I said, "Why were y'all disappointed?" She said, "We were led to believe you were bringing a dog." They were looking forward to the stress release of petting my dog. That's what they were looking forward to. So,
yeah, no, I think quite apart from the fact that it makes it easier to get around, than using that cane. I think I said in my first book that some people view cane. It is a physical sport. It's a physical contact sport. That's what cane travel is. I mean, obviously you don't want to hit people over the head with the cane, but it really is banging off objects and making those connections between what's happening around you. A dog makes it so much easier to walk more fluidly and more relaxed. So in that sense, it's also easier for me, at least.
Well, see, you just went and answered the question I was going to ask next, because I know that you were a cane user before being a guide dog user, and I thought that it would be nice to know what you thought about the differences or advantages, disadvantages between the two.
Yeah, as I said, I always knew I was going to get a dog, but when I went to college, I was way too busy doing things that would have been unfriendly for a dog. I was in the marching band, and we traveled a lot. I did a lot of travel in conjunction with my work in the orchestra. And of course, I did the usual things that college kids do, which usually, for in my case, meant getting drunk way too often and staying out way too late and way too many nights. And for that, environment, having a dog was the wrong approach. But once I graduated, I was raised around dogs. I knew at some point I'd want a dog. And so once I graduated and went on to graduate school and moved into my own apartment, then I got my first dog.
And that's the one thing I've been around dog owners. I went through the Chris Cole Rehab Center in Austin, Texas before college. I went to Lions World Services, as we both did, to get the jobs with the IRS.
Actually, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. Well, I did. But so I've been around more than a few guide dogs. And the one thing the book actually brings home that just I really didn't. I thought I knew, but really didn't know, is just how structured and ritualized a person's schedule has to be with a guide dog, that is.
Yes, it really is true. And there is no coincidence that the guide dog schools originally started serving veterans who were blinded for one reason or another. And those veterans went through a military program that was very, very structured. And you really have to learn to, having a dog, like being a parent, is their responsibility. And so part of what they're trying to teach you at guide dog schools is to take on that responsibility. And so you are at a very ritual or very regimented schedule. It's actually much better now than it used to be when I started.
Yeah, the last person I lived with who had a dog, his watch had like 7 different alarms on it. It was always going off, telling him he needed to do something for the dog.
Well, I'm not quite as bad as that, but I do try to keep on a fairly strict, regular schedule so that he can get what he needs.
All right, for my dog-loving friends, and assuming somewhere in the future, my family's going to get another dog. Any opinions on proper food?
No, I've been feeding IAMs that's what this Guiding Eyes has been using for years, and that's what I use. I've had no trouble with it at all. I know some people have allergies, and that's real, and they should do what they need to do. But in my case, I've given them dry IAMs chunks for probably for the past 30 years with no trouble at all.
All right. Well, I would have felt bad if I didn't ask that question, because you kind of feel like that as highly valued as those dogs are, or the kind of money, time, and effort they spend training them, that if anybody would have a solid idea on what to feed them, it would be the Guiding Eyes people.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the way I view it. And again, they're not opposed to other foods, and sometimes dogs need special, other diets, and that's fine. But I've been very fortunate not to have that need.
Yeah, I recently watched a segment on 60 Minutes or the nightly news where they were talking about the whole process from beginning to end of delivering a guide dog to its owner, that they spend over $50,000 per dog.
That's what the school says, and I'm sure it's right. I mean, it's a very intensive training, not just getting the dog through the puppy raising program and testing to make sure that they're ready to be a guide dog, and then taking them through the guide dog program, and some of them don't make it through that step, and then to do the matching and the pairing and all that I write about in the book. And then, even then sometimes it doesn't work. They've gotten much better at doing matching, and again, since I started. But, it's a very time-intensive program, and the Guiding Eyes and also other schools do a really good job. I mean, I think it's one of the more remarkable programs I've ever experienced. And as I write about in Breaking Barriers, there's a lot of stuff that businesses can learn from what Guiding Eyes does and how they do it.
I see. I'm glad you said that, because I don't often write enough questions down for myself. I'm not as organized as I should be. I would like you to share some of the lessons that you think people, businesses, and people in general, just the average person who might be listening to us, could take from your experiences with Guiding Eyes and the training you received for your dogs.
The most important, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the reasons why Guiding Eyes is so successful is that everybody there knows why they're there. I know that sounds really silly, but everybody knows that they're there to get a dog. That means for us guide dog users, trainees, we need to do certain things to make it more likely that we'll be successful. And as far as the Guiding Eyes staff, they need to do certain things to make sure that we have a better shot at being successful. We all know why we're there. The reason that's relevant to businesses is you'd be really surprised how many times people are there and really don't know what the mission of their organization is, or don't know what the mission of their department is, or how often the mission of the organization differs from the mission of the department. So in the case of the IRS, to give one example, we were supposed to be giving quality customer service and answering taxpayer questions, which is fine, except that the mission of the IRS is to take as much money from the taxpayer as they can legally. And so the two aren't exactly the same. And so it created some real tensions. And that's another story which I won't go into here. But the idea is often we have we don't have a clear sense of why we're working. I was running a project with the work team trying to get them to work better together. And one of the questions I asked them was, what is your mission? There are 10 of you. What are you trying to accomplish? And we got 10 different answers. Well, if you're going to have 10 different answers, you're not going to be able to work together. And that was part of their problem. So and the thing with Guiding Eyes is you have people coming in from all backgrounds, all age groups, both genders, from all different parts of the country, and you have comparatively little conflict. There is some, it's not perfect, but one of the reasons there's comparatively little conflict is because everybody knows why they're there, and it makes it so much easier to get along. So that's the first major lesson. The second major lesson is that the training staff is really good about managing people and teaching people how to develop skills. And they don't spend a lot of time preaching. They don't spend a lot of time telling people how to do it. Most of it is, one-on-one instruction, work instruction, job instruction, almost like a job coach. And so you get the lectures at night, but most of the work is done on the street many organizations spend way too much time preaching instead of, getting into the employees and working with them to be better at what they do in a variety of ways. But the whole sort of preaching piece is and the third one I would say, and there are a few others I mentioned in the book, is this idea of regulating tension. Tension is this sort of hidden electricity that, if managed correctly, will make people more effective. If the tension is too high, we all know what happens if the tension is too high. We freeze, we want to run, we can't function very well. If the tension is too low, we also don't function very well. If we're bored, if we yawn a lot, right? If we do things, we don't function well. So if people can learn, if managers can learn, or parents or people in authority can learn to manage that tension, they're more likely to get better results. And that's a tricky area, but Guiding Eyes does that, and most guide dog school staff do that really, really well. You can't not be a good dog instructor if you can't manage that tension.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the first one you mentioned, and how many people who, especially online business owners, who, if you look at their website or you look at what they're trying to offer to people, and then you look at the images or their tagline, the opening statement on their website, and you realize what you're telling people you do in these first few seconds they see you and what you actually do are two different things.
Yeah, no, it's very, very common. And it's even more dispiriting when you show up in an organization and you think you know what the organization supposedly does, and then you learn that they do something very different. That in practicality, they say they do X, but they really do Y. And that's, for an employee, that could be very, very hard to take.
Yeah, especially if you go through a training period where they're teaching you one philosophy towards doing a job, and then you get into the work environment and find out that the people who do that job every day have a totally different view as to how it's supposed to be done and what the goals are.
And rightfully so, because they're on the job. They don't care about the training program. They've been doing the work for years in many cases. And so they don't take the training very seriously anymore because they know the training has no relevance to what they do. So these are serious issues. And those employers who get this idea of getting the mission right and communicating it well and making sure they live by those values are much more effective in the long run.
All right. Now, we need to talk about your new book a little. I know I fall into this trap sometimes, that you get used to answering the questions or telling the stories from the first one, and they don't get around to asking you about the second one. So it's called Breaking It Down and Connecting the Dots, and it's some of your best blog posts from your website, peteraltschul.com. And I was I want to give you credit for doing something that I've only recently started doing. I, for years, did not have the guts to write about politics on my website, and I still avoid it. Or if I'm not outright avoiding it, I use all the big boy words, if you know what I'm saying. I try, if I'm going to make a point, I try not to inflame people. But I really love your style of writing on your blog, and I can't wait to read the second book because of it. And some of your writing is very deep. It's very thoughtful. It requires you to read it more than once sometimes in order to really understand what you're reading. But man, I just can't tell you how much I love the piece you did on Donald Trump recently after his year anniversary in office.
Thank you. That was sort of a satire piece, but basically I was imagine if it's the blog I think you're talking about, it's the one where I imagine Donald Trump winning as a Democrat. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah,
that's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, and it was sort of interesting to sort of reflect that, what if things have been a little different? How would things have been different? And the answer, if people, you can read the blog post. What did I call it? I can't remember, but anyway, it's there. It's a relatively recent blog. It was written right around the anniversary of the election, so it was written sometime in early November of this year. So folks can, it's there. I wish I could really recall.
Yeah, I wish I could too. And the thing is, for years he said that if he were going to run for president, he would run as a Democrat. He's contributed to Democratic causes over the years and to candidates.
Yeah.
And he's had disagreements with many popular and famous Republicans over the years. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think that if he had won, he should have ran as a Democrat. But I just thought it was I just think the fact that you are so open and writing about politics, and because I'll be honest with you, Trump scares me. He has 51+ million followers on Twitter. And that's an awfully big gorilla to get on the wrong side of if you're running a small business.
Yeah, I'm not a particular fan of President Trump either. And if it's any consolation, there is some talk that at least a third of those 51 million followers are bots. They're not true followers, but still, it's a large following, and it is kind of intimidating. And when I write these blogs, I do write satire, but I do try to be fair. I do try to, accurately portray what I think the side that I don't agree with is. And I don't just write about politics. I write about other things as well. I write about.
I know you write about sports, about personalities, about events going on in your life. I mean, it's just that I'm a scaredy cat, so I had to make sure I talked to you about your politics, because it's just not something a lot of people are doing right now, unless they're out to create controversy, and that's not your goal.
No, it isn't my goal, and that's really the point of one of the points of this second book. Although I didn't realize that when I was trying to put it together, the idea that there really are ways, whether it's addressing politics or even addressing family issues or addressing workplace issues or addressing diversity issues, where we can make it more likely that we can have conversations that are civil, even though we don't agree on certain things. And that's, or do things that can influence each other, even though we don't agree on whatever it is we're having a hassle with at the moment.
Yeah. Now, as somebody who's been doing this pretty much all your life, at least your professional life, does it bother you that we seem to be in a time period where there is no conversation? There's I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're evil?
There's way too much of that, and that does bother me a lot. The thing that I find more annoying than even that is I live in a university town. I live in Columbia, Missouri. And there are plenty of people. Missouri is very much a Trump state, and I'm not a Trump person. And I've had many civil conversations with people who are Trump supporters, and we've had, we're friends. If we're not friends, we're colleagues. And I think that these conversations happen more often than we think. They happen under the radar. And what I find really irritating is that the talking heads, whether it be Fox News or MSNBC or fill in the blank, CNN is another one, prize the we don't get along piece. They strive for conflict. They don't encourage people to get beyond, and that's how they make their money. And And I believe that's one of the main reasons that President Trump won the election, because we're so programmed into this kind of dialogue, in this kind of approach. It's not dialogue. It's, I don't know what you want to call it.
Well, it's been referred to as warfare, and people
warfare. No, it's exactly right. And in fact, one of the sections of the book is called Culture War Issues, Culture War, where I try to help people see, controversial topics in slightly different ways. But it's really too bad. I wish more media outlets would make an effort to find that common ground. And still, you can still talk about the agreement, the disagreement. That's still, of course, appropriate and important. But if you don't help people see where they agree on, it's impossible to get beyond the shouting.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question that has occurred to me more than once over the years. Do you think that progressive continued polarization, do you think it could have been maybe lessened somewhat if we hadn't allowed the equal time doctrine to expire, or do you think that plays any role in it?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, my sense about the equal time protection is it put a fig leaf on the disagreements. I mean, you'd have a radio station that was either progressive or conservative, and you knew where they stood, and they bring on somebody in honor, and it was all condescending. It was all the idea that they're having serious disagreement, conversations was sort of a laugh. So I'm not, there are times when I wish that were back in place, but part of the problem is if you force people to do things, they resent it. That's part of the problem with diversity, getting people to deal with diversity issues. If they feel forced to do it, they're less likely to do it. The same thing applies to the taxi folks. I mean, they were required to take this customer service course, and they resented the hell out of it. And, the idea that that customer service was going to be improved as a result was kind of silly. I mean, I tried to do things in a way that helped them sort of see how the customers were reacting to them. But, realistically, they were irritated. I mean, they lost 4 hours of their time, and they had to pay $20 for the honor. I mean, who wouldn't be happy? And
during that 4 hours, they are not out there in their taxi earning income.
That's exactly right. And they didn't like the mayor. So it was one of those things that, I mean, I spent the first 45 minutes of that program just getting them to the point where they could even begin to listen to me. I mean, that was really the first 45 minutes of every program. And then, then it got to the point where we could have some interesting conversations, and that was great. But that first 45 minutes, they had to relax and unwind a little bit. Otherwise, nothing would happen.
Okay. Now, you've had good conversations with Trump people and with people from all around the world pretty much. And when I've traveled, I have even stayed with Trump supporters and still had a good time and enjoyed some great conversations. What are some things you can think of that would help people, either the diehard Trump supporters or the people that didn't support Trump, so they can start having more of these conversations? Because as we all know, these things happen one person at a time.
Yeah. Let me say a couple of things. The first thing is, it helps me to remember that we're all on a continuum, right? There are the hardcore Trump supporters, and there are the hardcore Trump haters, and then there are many people in between. So if I'm talking to somebody, if I can keep open the possibility that this guy isn't a hardcore guy, that's okay. And then we can have serious conversations, and we can still disagree. But he knows that there are problems with Trump, and I know there are problems with, in this case, Hillary Clinton, and we could agree on a lot of that stuff and come down on different sides of the issue. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say, and this is one of the things I find irritating, there's a difference between sort of fighting and having a conversation. And what I'm talking about is there's a guy on progressive radio named Tom Hartman, and one of the things he often says is, "I'm giving you some ammunition for the water fountain wars." And he's giving information to counter the statistics that conservatives use, and that's fine. But the problem is the implication seems to be, if you use these statistics, you'll get the other person to agree with you, which I think is utter nonsense. It's psychologically silly. The very least, what it might do is shut them up. It might get them to shut up, but it's
might get you punched too.
Yeah, right. But it's not going to change their opinion. And
exactly.
And most people on both the advocates on both sides of the issue seem to use this approach. Give them, how many times have you seen articles saying, here's how to address your uncle who disagrees with you during Thanksgiving? Well, fine, except that if you want to maintain a relationship with your uncle, using those talking points is going to do just the reverse, probably. So, keeping that in mind. And the third thing I would say is when I'm on my game, which sometimes I'm not, but if I'm on my game, my goal is not to change somebody's opinion. My job, what my hope is, I'll be able to explain why I believe what I believe in a way that they can understand it. That's all. That's my only goal. It's not to change their opinion, because I won't be able to probably. But, if we have a conversation and I get the sense when I leave that they have some understanding of where I'm coming from, then I've done what I set out to do. I've gotten to the point where it's not my goal to change somebody's opinion, because a lot of these conflicts are connected with how they were raised, the values they were raised around. And if like gun control, if you were raised around guns and I wasn't, if you were raised around guns, the idea of gun control takes a very different take than people like me who weren't raised around guns, although I, did learn how to shoot a gun, which is another conversation. It's those kinds of things. And then there's an article in the book called "The Elephant and Its Rider" that gives a few other suggestions. But those are the three big ones. This is the fourth one I probably should say, which is the value of stories.
I love that.
Stories, telling stories well, listening to stories well told really is a powerful way to build bridges. And the reason for that, in part, is most of the time when we're throwing statistics around, those are thoughts, right? 80% of this is that, and 20% of this is that. Those are all thoughts. But stories connect on both. Often, a good story connects both on the thoughts channel and the feelings channel. And you really need to connect on both to have a good conversation. That doesn't mean that you have to be on both channels equally. It just means that you have to acknowledge that both channels exist. And if you don't acknowledge one of those channels, all kinds of weird things are going to happen that you can't understand. Often this happens between spouses, right? You have the husband talking, the wife comes to them and says, I'm going to be stereotypical for a moment because it happens both ways. The wife comes and says, gee, I'm having this problem right now. And she starts talking about her feelings about the problem. And what does the husband usually do? He says, oh, well, here's how to solve the problem. And she gets irritated. Well, why does she get irritated? Because he is not acknowledging the feelings part of the problem. He's just focusing on the thoughts part of the problem. Whereas if he says, gee, that's a really tough problem, and really make sure that he is sure that he understands her feelings about the issue, then she might be in a better place to hear his way of addressing the issue. And the same thing applies if you're just dealing with on the feeling side, then the thoughts get lost, and that creates problems as well. So it's a question of finding the right balance. Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm here with Peter Altschul, peteraltschul.com, ALTSCHUL. And in addition to being a twice published author, he's also a public speaker, a musician, and seems to have spent most of his life helping people make connections and get along. So I hope y'all are listening to him and paying attention. And we talked about the guide dogs and both of your books and some of this politics. What are some of your other favorite topics or blog posts that you've written? What are some of your other passions, let's say?
Well, just going back to the second book for a moment, because we've only talked. That book is you're right. It's a mixture of my favorite blogs, but the blogs are divided into 9 different categories. And so the first category deals with influencing people. How can you influence people? And that primarily deals with family issues. In my case, I was learning to address 3 stepkids who come from a different kind of situation than when I came onto the scene. And that was a real challenge. And so there are some essays where I write about that. In the same section, I also write about my experiences swimming with dolphins and how that impacted me. I also write about my experiences in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and that was a major deal. So that's the first part. And the second part deals with organization behavior. How do you deal with workplace issues to help people be more effective and work with people who are different from them and to be more effective in general? So there's a lot of talk about diversity and leadership in that section. And then I write about music and I write about sports as a sports fan. I came out here and immediately got embroiled in University of Missouri football and basketball. Now I tutor student athletes, so I'm getting to know some of the athletes from different other sports as well, which has been really interesting for me. And then the last section, I've talked about sort of the politics piece and the rhetorical stuff. The last piece has to do with my life as a Christian. And there's several articles about my thoughts about Christianity and how it connects with the regular life. So the book itself is a composite of essays, and they're divided into these sections. And it's the kind of book that you can get and read, a section that interests you the most without having to read the entire book. But I hope you do read the entire book. There's lots there, I think. So.
Okay. Well, let's go back to just the one thing that you mentioned. I can't believe I didn't go back to it before now. Is what are some of the things that you have learned being the parent or step parent of these three kids, and has there been any challenges specific to being blind that you've managed to address during the time that might give some other people some ideas?
Well, one of the challenges I had was that where blindness was connected was that my kids are, of course, into video games. Video games are, I know there are video games made available for blind folks, but these are games that my stepsons primarily played, and there were lots of noise and lots of loud banging, and as in all other kids, it's hard to get them off the video games to do homework and to get them to come to dinner or get them to do much of anything sometimes. And that was a major challenge, just to get them to listen to me, to say, come on guys, it's dinner time, it's not like whatever. But one of the things that was also a struggle was because those games are so visual, it was sort of hard to get into their world of zombies and military people and space wars and, whatever they were doing. And apocalyptic stuff, and they did all the hardcore, not the hardcore games, but
it's hard to have a conversation with them when you don't have that same interest that's such a big part of their lives.
Right. Well, but over time, I sort of got a general feel for these games. I'd ask them questions. I'd ask them, and we'd have conversations. It helped that I was a music guy because both of them sort of like music, and a lot of the music on the video games are sort of, I think, sort of lousy, but it gave us a chance to sort of talk about, the music and what it meant and how it sort of added to the atmosphere. And one of my stepkids has some musical talent. And so another one of my stepkids turned out he liked like 1940s, 1950s music. So that gave us, and so he had a video game where that music was playing a lot. So we talked about, 40s and 50s music. It's not my area of expertise per se, but I know enough about it that I could sound intelligent. And so it never really. And then of course they had the sports video games. One of my stepsons is a scholarship football player at a Division II school, and so he often was playing football games. And I know I'm a sports fan, so I know something about football. So he and I over time got to talk about football and strategy, and I could no longer be a defensive lineman, then I can paint a house effectively, but I can't talk about the strategy of football. So he and I did quite a bit of that. In fact, there's an article in the book that I write about him when his team went to the state championship game and what that was like for him and for me and for my wife and how crazy it was. And it was so so over time we worked around it. But there was always a bit of a distance because there were some things I'm never going to fully understand, both because of generational things and because I can't see.
Yeah. During the championship game, were you a good parent or a bad parent?
I didn't go. I didn't go to the semifinals either, and the reason was because I came to the conclusion that it was impossible to follow the game. There was no play-by-play. There was no very little description even from the PA. Sometimes they'll say, so-and-so has the ball, gain 3 yards, 2nd and 7. It wasn't any of that. So I literally couldn't follow the game, and my wife and I came to the conclusion it's ridiculous for you to go. Stay home, listen to the game, and then when Joseph comes home, you can talk about it. And that seemed to work best. And I think Joseph understood that. That for me it was best so that I could come and we could talk about this play and that play and why did that happen and what do what did you learn from that experience, and we could have those kinds of conversations that we could never have had if I'd gone to the game.
Well, it's all about finding the solutions that work for each of us. And that's the one thing that I try to explain to people is that there is no one blind person, just like there is no one Hispanic or one black person. And we all have our own individual ways of dealing with the challenges that we come across every day.
Yeah. And one of the things I learned from one of my mentors is there's more differences within groups than between groups. And that's sort of what you just said. There's more variability among blind people and disabled people and fill in the blank than there is between blind people and non-blind people and everything else. There's a lot of variability within each group.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the time that we allotted for this. What are some final thoughts you might have for people who are listening?
Well, on a purely mercenary matter, I would encourage you to buy both books and read them and share them. If you want to be added to my blog email list, if you go to my site, there's a place that says contact the author. Click on that and send me a note and I'll add you to my list. I blog about everything under the sun. So you might get a thing on politics, you might get something about music, you might get something about, you've already said this, but I don't guarantee I'll write about the same kinds of things every week. It whatever grabs my attention is what I write about. But if you want to be added to my list, I will happily add you. The other thing I would say is I'm looking to broaden my speaking engagements. So if you know folks who might be interested in hearing me speak about the kinds of things we've talked about, please let me know, and I will gladly get back in touch with you. And then beyond the mercenary piece, I would say, if you do nothing else for 2018, I would encourage you to try to either find somebody or strengthen a relationship with somebody who doesn't agree with you about a significant subject, whatever that is. And that doesn't mean to say the goal is not to advocate for your point of view necessarily. It's just to deepen a relationship with somebody who disagrees with you about something. If all of us did that, with one or two people every year, we'd be a much better country.
Yeah, I think somebody recently, I think it was former General McRaven, in his book, he talks about how if we would try focus on influencing 10 people per generation, in a few generations, we could change the world.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I'm not even suggesting influencing per se. I'm just suggesting, given how divided we are, if you know of somebody who doesn't agree with you, but you think you have some common ground with, just strengthen that relationship. Yeah. Not to change somebody's opinion, not to change their politics, just to get to know somebody a little different from you. And as I said, if we did nothing else but that, we'd be a better place. But I agree with the influencing piece as well. I think that's another good one.
Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed getting to finally talk with you. I'm looking forward to reading your second book. I enjoyed the first one thoroughly, and I thank you for taking the time to come and talk to people. And I just want to remind the people that are watching is if I can do this, be the writer and the blogger, if Peter can be the writer and the blogger and speaker, then what is your excuse? So thank you, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay. Okay, I think we had a very good conversation with Peter. Again, you can find him at peteraltschul.com, Altschul. He's led a very fascinating life, and I think he proves a few things that I'd like to make sure we think about. One is that as bloggers or podcasters or online business people, you're always being told you have to find what your niche is, you have to get laser focused on it, and everything you do has to be in support of that niche. But here we have a guy who's managing a pretty his blog is getting good traffic. People are entertained, educated, and maybe even inspired a little by reading his posts. And yet his posts are all over the map. You know, he talks about what interests him, what affects him, and he does it in an honest manner. And that's probably why it's working for him. But, you know, he talks about sports, politics, religion, social issues. So that's one thing I take from this. And it's actually kind of something I have had conversations with people about who are always telling me, Max, you know, you really are all over the map and you need to pick one or two things and just really focus on those. So that's important. I think the other thing he reminds us of is, especially in this day and age, you don't have to know exactly who you or what you're going to be when you're in high school or junior high school or college. You know, you can start out thinking you're going to be one thing. You can work that a while, find out if you like it or not, see if you excel at it, if people appreciate you doing it. And then if that doesn't work, like with Peter and music, if it doesn't work, then move on to something else. See what other skills you have. Find out what other things interest you. What are you curious about or passionate about? And find ways to put those things that you love into some form where you can make a living from it, or where you can at least feel appreciated and rewarded by doing it while you work a job that pays the bills, if that's the situation you end up in. So that's something. I'm reminded of the value of pets. I didn't know this until after we were through, but Peter's latest dog, Heath, was in the photo and getting a good rub down during my interview. I hope he didn't distract y'all. I hope maybe he didn't make you think I'd rather be petting my dog. But, you know, he's had 6 different dogs in 30 years, let's say. That takes a lot of adjustment. You know, he has had to adjust to new personalities, new idiosyncrasies of the breed, and also changes in his life circumstances as far as urban to suburban, single to married, and with stepchildren. I really wish I had done a better job of getting him to talk about being a parent and being visually impaired. But hey, as I like to tell people all the time, you do it as well as you can do it at the time, and then you either do it better or you do more the next time. So I have a feeling that if my experience is any judge, this won't be the last book that Peter writes. And hopefully I'll get to have him on my show again in the future. And if not, I'm sure I will catch him on somebody else's radio show or podcast or maybe even TV show where we get some more concrete or definitive answers to what it was like and what people can learn. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you spending your time with me. I know that you have lots of demands on your time. You don't have a lot of it to spare, and I appreciate the fact that you spend a few minutes of it with me. So thank you very much. This has been What's Your Excuse? I am Maxwell Ivy, known around the world as The Blind Blogger. You can find me at theblindblogger.net. And speaking of mercenary, I hope you decide to pick up a copy of my latest book, The Blind Bloggers NYC Adventures, subtitle, How You Can Make Your Dreams Come True. And that book is available in electronic or print from Amazon, or you can purchase it directly from my website, where I'm also offering autographed copies, theblindblogger.net. Hope you head over there and check me out. Until next time, thank you, God bless you, and take care out there. Too many times we stand aside and let the waters slip away, till what we've put off to tomorrow has finally come today. So don't stand upon the shoreline and say you're satisfied. Choose to chance the rapids and dare to dance the tide. I will sail my vessel till the river runs dry.